We're talking with Major James H. Oswago. He is the former CEO of the IEBC and he joins us in the hot seat this morning. Major, good morning.
Good morning, Mom.
How are you?
Fine.
Karibu sana.
Asante sana.
There was a time where we saw you all the time. There were so many things going on at the same time. It's good to have you here because we carry on some of those conversations at a time where many are saying, you know what, the IEBC in its constitution has a lot of work to do to make the next election and the forward-thinking moves of a commission then actually viable. And that's the conversation that we'll be having with you today in terms of the IEBC itself and the viability of the 2010 constitution. So thank you so much for being in the hot seat of the Situation Room. We're going to welcome you in true Situation Room style. CT goes, you may know this young man, to a different African country every week. He comes back with a basket full of proverbs. He'll tell you which country he's from. He'll give you the proverb. And then we would like you to interpret that for us and tell us what you think it means.
You know, this is one of the few countries on this continent that actually has problems with cyclones. Tumultuous winds that come with a lot of water and tends to be extremely destructive. But it is next to the Indian Ocean, so it is in oceans where you get a lot of cyclones. This is the Republic of Mozambique. The proverb, on a dead tree, there are no monkeys. On a dead tree, there are no monkeys. What do you think this proverb means?
That's the proverb.
Yes.
That's the proverb.
Then, on a dead tree, there are no monkeys.
Yes.
I presume monkeys go up trees for a purpose.
Yes, they do.
And if I were a monkey, I would not go on a tree where it's dead. I don't get there.
So a dead tree doesn't have anything
No.
that would interest the monkey.
I don't think so.
The monkey doesn't feed on dry twigs and dry branches.
Exactly. So if the monkey's there, then there's some sort of life.
Where a monkey goes, there must be something of interest, whether life or something to eat, unless it is for security. But a dead tree, maybe with no interest. For a monkey, I wouldn't go over a dead tree, unless it is for our own security and safety.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much for that interpretation. Always interesting to hear what folks think. We're getting into interesting seasons and interesting times. We're looking at 2 years after the last election. Usually in Kenya, when we talk about the Independent Electorates and Boundaries Commission, it usually only comes into play in the minds of people around an election or around the time where folks will go to the ballot. And sometimes we forget or ignore the fact that there's a lot of work that the commission gets involved in after and even before an election. So now we're looking at the constitution of the IEBC. We're looking at a time where commissioners were being nominated and then selected, and then also a chairperson and his or her deputy also being selected. All of this happening at the same time, maybe late in the game, many would say, because many things have not been done over the last 2 years. Now, when we look at constitutionality, it makes it difficult for a number of things, whereby certain by-elections should have been held. There were certain seats that were left vacant by virtue of the fact that appointments were made or by the natural occurrences of death, for example. But those seats have not been filled. So let's look at an IEBC which was not able to fulfill certain things according to the Constitution. What would be your view and what would be your take on that before we now look at appointments going forward?
Well, thank you very much. The work that we do is not just running by elections.
Exactly.
Because what we have now are by elections which have not been done for some while. But the work is much more important than that. You don't appoint a commission on Monday, ideally, and then on Tuesday you task that commissioner to run by election. there is an organization called International IDEA. And this is like the Harvard and the Yale of University of elections. And they have studied elections. And they say that it requires 2 years from the moment a new commissioner is appointed to be sufficiently inducted and able to run an election, because there is no university where you go to run an election. An election is run by a process of apprenticeship. An election is run by a process of incrementalism. You learn by doing. So picking up a neophyte who has never run an election and then the following day asking them to run an election is not the way it is done. So that is number one problem. They have the technical staff, and IEBC have excellent technical staff below the director level. And they can deal with the technical issues. But an election is not an election unless the commissioners are involved, because the law provides that the commissioners provide guidance, oversight, strategy, and supervision. So you need an informed person to supervise a technical individual running an election. So the biggest problem is not that you run through election. The biggest problem is being prepared, being equipped, being able within this short period to run an election, because that will determine the kind of electoral outcomes you come up with.
So, it seems from what you've said, then we seem to be in a bit of a problem. Because if you said that a commissioner who goes through the process and then is then appointed and is supposed to start work, and in this case we're looking at 7 of them, that they need about 2 years to then be ready. And like you said, it's not just the only duty that a commission is tasked with. There are other things, many other things. So would they be ready? We're in April of 2025. Give or take 2 years is the preparation process. Puts us at April 2027, 4 months out of another election.
Technically, they'll not be ready. But they'll run the election. They'll run the by-election. They'll go through the process. And at the end of it, they deliver some outcome.
Which is not acceptable in terms of a result, which you've said before.
If you ask me, never should you ask an individual to run an election who has not had a minimum of 2 years of preparation, particularly as a commissioner. We've done this before several times in Kenya, where we appoint individuals, and before they are sufficiently prepared, you are exposing them to run an election. And this also happened most recently as we were moving towards the 2022 election. 4 new commissioners were elected, I would say hastily, and then without even 1 year's exposure, they were running an election. And yet those vacancies had been there for almost 3 years. So you had vacancies for 4 years, they remain unfulfilled, and then just as an election was now approaching, people are appointed, I might say in a hurry, and then they are now unleashed to run an election with predictable results and predictable consequences.
Now, Oswago, you speak of we have a commission that would be put in place and would not be ready, yet elections will be hard, which goes to beg the question, if at all we have the knowledge that we need to have commissioners who have 2+ years of experience, why do we keep on doing the same mistakes over and over again? Is it that we don't learn, or we just don't care about our elections and the fidelity of it?
Thank you, Dennis. Let me answer you by asking you, why do you think every year we have deluge of floods in Kano Plains, and every year people get displaced, and every year cows get swept? Why do you think in Nairobi here it rains like now it's about, no? And in a day or two, we'll have the roads floods, drainages clogged, major thoroughways clogged. Why do you think we have that regularly in our country?
One would say because we fail to plan for what's coming.
I think it's the same thing. These are the characteristics of underdevelopment. We have accustomed ourselves to being ordinary. We have accustomed ourselves. When you get comfortable with that thing which is not good, you come to accept it. You fail to think for it, to plan for it. For instance, you have a vacancy in the commission, and the vacancy runs for 4 years. Then you appoint commissioners, and you immediately ask them to run a general election, not just a by-election. 4 years or 3 years, the vacancy exists, and then towards the end you say run an election. And the activity that you are asking them to do is not just an ordinary activity. This is a general election. So you wonder, if it happened once, you might say that was some oversight, that was maybe a political thing. But if this becomes the order of doing things, if this becomes the way we do things, and it is not only the way we run elections that we happen to be hurtling and drifting into an election, although we have the time to prepare, this becomes part of us. Yeah.
So at some point, when you're talking about, at some point, the rain will stop. You have an election and you'll get out. So is there for forgetfulness, or are we talking about there's really no deliberateness, there's no intention to actually get something and get it done right the first time or one time, so that later all you're working with is making sure that you tweak it here and there?
The state exists for a purpose. And the state exists to predict problems and to solve them. If a state cannot predict problems, if a state cannot solve problems, if a state cannot plan for problems, there is a name for it, and that is a failed state. Now, we are not there yet. But those are the characteristics of an entity that is failing. That we have critical things that we should prepare for, critical things that we think for in advance, plan for, and then yet we don't do them. And the outcome is predictable. See, when you appoint commissioners who have never run an election, and then you ask them to run an election, and you expect the outcome of that election to be world-class, to be free, fair, accountable. That is expecting too much, even from nature.
I need to ask this question. The institute that you quoted gives a time span of 2 years within which, a 2-year time span, which they consider to be a period that would give adequate preparation. Our constitution doesn't specify a time. No, it doesn't. Just talks about adequate preparation. That's all it talks about. Why is 6 months not adequate, and why is it only adequate if it is 2 years?
6 months for?
I'm saying, if we're talking about preparation and readiness for an election, you talked about the 2-year time period.
Oh, yeah. What I meant is,
yes,
what they're saying is that this is not what that means is this. An election election management is a profession.
yes,
To my mind, there is no university you go for and come out with a bachelor degree in elections or a master's degree in elections. But there's already been, for the last 200 years or so, an accumulation of knowledge or background on what really constitutes
credible election.
credible election.
Yes.
The things that you must do in order to run a good election.
Yes.
And they're saying you have to learn those. You can only learn them through a process of apprenticeship. That apprenticeship includes running an election itself, observing somebody else running an election, and then being exposed to the process. So if you were appointed today, CT, and you spent 2 years in IEBC, not running an election, doing those things that they do in the intervening period between the last election and the next one. You'll be doing things like voter registration. You'll be doing things like voter education. You'll be doing things like financing. You'll be doing things like all those things. And before an election, they develop a timeline. They call it the snake. Things that follow each other. That exposure prepares you for you to run an election. And that is why they say it takes time for you to reach a certain level of competency where you can now run an election. That's what it means. That running an election requires preparation, requires a certain level of ability, certain level to be self-confident for you to run an election. It is 2 years because they picked the time 2 years. And I think that is because of so many other things. I recall a CEO in 2010, these new commissioners and the new constitution, they arrived at IEBC, and it was our job to help them seamlessly get into the system and know. So you plan for it. You say they'll do this, you draw a program. And that is what it means when it says that you require at least 2 years of preparation.
Let me tell you what I was thinking about and what was guiding my thinking. If it is training and inducting someone into a process and it's an apprenticeship one, essentially you are looking at what other people are doing and following their lead. If one were to go to a higher institution for learning, they are, you mentioned degree courses, there are also diploma courses, there are even certificate courses. So my question really was, is there a certificate course for this? Instead of 2 years, can you fast track these processes in 6 months? That's really what I was asking.
No. The reason you can't fast track is, to my mind, to my knowledge, I have never heard of an institution you walk in to learn how to run an election.
Okay.
You can go to university, do political science, learn all those things. But to date, to my recollection, there's nowhere you can go to and say, now we are going to learn an election.
It has to be experience.
That is what it is. The nearest that it comes to what CT is saying was in South Africa, where Professor Guto, the late, came up with, tried to build what you call a critical mass. And his concern, and they call it managing democratic election in Africa. And he aimed to build, and he was working with the University of South Africa. And he was thinking that together in collaboration with the university, they would expose people to the art and the practice of running an election. And in the process, they'll build a critical mass of individuals who can later on be used to run an election if required. That is the nearest that you can come to going to a university or going to a specific place. So what we are left with is a commission like IEBC. There is a process of recruitment. You recruit them, then you ask them to run an election.
Yeah.
If you are that critical mass, at the stage of advertisement, you'd put something like experience in previous running of election is an added advantage. Or you deliberately be seeking to advantage people who have applied but who have experience in running an election. So when you pick them to help you to run the election.
I mean, when you talk about these periods that you talk about, the 2 years and whatnot, we go back to 2008 when Kriegler gave his report and also gave the recommendations of formation of an electoral body 2 years to the elections. We're talking about 2008. And this is something that we do know. which begs the question, is there political goodwill in ensuring that we have an IEBC that is functional at all times? Because at the end of the day, political goodwill is important in ensuring that we have a commission that works. So do we have that in this country?
Certainly, there is goodwill to have a commission, and to have a commission that works. But one wonders, and I have no explanation, because if we have prioritized having a commission that works, then equally we should prioritize doing the sorts of things that we are talking about. So here we are, where we are saying we want a functioning IEBC, we want an effective IEBC. And yet we can look at that IEBC get basically dysfunctional. When the institution atrophies, we look from afar until such time that when we need it. The keyword to that is that perhaps in the government there should be a specific department or a specific ministry or a specific individual who is responsible for the affairs either of all the constitutional commissions or of IEBC. Today, I know that the vice president was given responsibility for political oversight of all these constitutional commissions. Maybe if a specific directorate or a specific department or a specific individual was given the mandate to say, part of your work is to ensure that the constitutional commissions and the independent officers work as prescribed and contemplated in the Constitution.
Right.
In the absence of that, you have two things. One, you have constitutional commissions and independent officers, which by dint of the Constitution are supposed to be autonomous and independent. Because they're autonomous and independent, it means less interference from outside. It means they work independently of the executive. And yet it is that executive that is supposed to facilitate many of the things that they do. So unless there is, we move from that to a position where we say, this particular office will be responsible for making sure that these constitutional officers work to the level that is envisaged in the Constitution.
Former CEO of the IEBC, Major James H. Oswago, is our guest this hour, and we're looking at, all right, IEBC and constitutionality. Is it possible then to implement all of this? And of course, one of the things that comes with constitutionality or constitutionalism is that you should be able to go through an election without it being rigged or stolen, right? That you should be able to have the people's voice heard by way of going to the ballot, casting their vote, and then waiting for the results that came out in a credible manner. Now, we had an entire election. An entire election was nullified because the process or the channel through which results then were achieved had a little bit of a question. And the Supreme Court said, you know what, because of that question, we're going to nullify the events, we're going to nullify the results, and we're going to ask all the good people of Kenya to go back to the ballot, right? Because of process. Process was an issue. We're not saying that the election result was wrong. We're saying the process that you reached was wrong, or that it had a question, right? Another process today that is being questioned is this whole business of counting the vote at the polling station, getting a result, having that form. I don't even know, 33, 4, A, B, C. We go through the whole alphabet. 34. A. Right? At this rate, we can even give it another alphabet. Who knows? All right? But for some reason, this process whereby you have the results at the polling station, right? And for all intents and purposes, the election is over. It's done, isn't it? You have the numbers. But for some reason, I don't know who came up with this, and maybe you can give us some insight. We said, you know what? It's provisional. And we're going to make it secure when everybody from around the country finds their way to the Bomas of Kenya, or for wherever they decide it's going to be. Bomas is maybe not going to be ready by 2027. They said that we will now whatever was said at the polling station is okay, and it was signed off by a returning officer. But to give it more credibility, we need everybody to come and have a kumbaya moment where we will then now say, this is the result. Process. Today, there are suggestions that, you know what, declare the election at the polling station. That is what we should do. Anything you do beyond that really doesn't matter. Do you think that that's an element of process that needs to be taken into consideration to avoid any kind of hanky-panky? Because, you know, the roads can be long. That avoids any kind of hanky-panky between the polling station and this national tallying center.
You are asking me a question that should take 6 hours to answer.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll give you 6 minutes.
Yes. Now, with 6 minutes, you're basically asking me 2 questions in one. One, the one that deals with the process issues which you've mentioned, and that is because being the basis for the nullification of the previous election. But the larger question, in my view, is the question that deals with the macro environment in which the elections are done. Part of the problem in Kenya is we tend to over-focus on that process. And we believe or hope that by working on the process, you may avoid the larger issues. My approach would be different. Deal with the larger environment in which election is done, and then the process will take care of itself. Now, democracy and election are different things. You can't conflate election to democracy. The quality of election you get depends on the type of democracy you have. But the quality of that election is a demonstration of what kind of democracy you have, isn't it? Now, how do we get a democracy where elections are delivered, which are free, which are fair, which are accountable? All right? Because the Kenyan Constitution has a provision that says sovereignty of the people. Sovereignty of the people means the people are sovereign, they decide. So how do we as Kenyans build a system of election? Forget about the process for the time being. A system and an arrangement of institutions that itself works to ensure that the election that we are going to do are themselves credible. I'll mention 4 things or 5.
Okay.
Number 1, and because I've got 6 minutes, I'll summarize. Now,
okay.
Number 1 thing that Kenyans must do, decongest the presidency. Decongest the presidency means, as Kenyans were fighting for the multi-party, for the new constitution, you heard of this term imperial presidency.
Yes.
An imperial presidency, that is not a term that was coined by Kenyans. Imperial presidency was a term that was coined by an American professor called some American professor. He did that. The individual who also coined the term judicial activism. An imperial presidency means a president that can get away with anything he wants. And that is what Kenyans wanted, and that was the original design in the Bomas project. We killed that. So if Kenyans really, really want an election that will be free, fair, decongest the presidency, which can only mean distribute some of those powers in the president to another institution, which can only mean, for the purposes, maybe create the office of the prime minister. We seem to find it anathema. There are Kenyans who are allergic to the term, to the office, prime minister, you know. And we forget that in all democracies in the world, if there are about 170 countries which call themselves democratic, and you take 30, which are the best run democratic countries in the world, virtually all of them have system with a prime minister.
Yes.
Except France and America. Everywhere else, and Africa, where every place you have president. And there's a reason for that. And there's a reason we can get into that. So one, decongest the presidency, number 1. As it is today, the presidency is so attractive, and people think that, when we hear this thing, we must be in government, we must be in this, we must be in this. It is the expectation that when your person is the president, then certain things will flow to you by virtue of having your own in the president.
Right.
But if you decongested it, where you have the office of the president and office of the prime minister, and all these offices, each has a constitutional function. In France, the president has got a constitutional function of, say, defense and foreign affairs. And they also have a prime minister who also have a constitutional remit.
Right.
It is called cohabitation.
Sorry,
You
his
can
name
have
just,
that.
yeah, the name of this gentleman just came to me. I believe Arthur Schlesinger is
Arthur
the one
Schlesinger.
who spoke of an imperial president.
Yes.
A presidency in his book.
Okay.
Arthur Schlesinger.
Okay.
Arthur Schlesinger is the professor of
Yeah.
history, not
Yeah.
of law.
Yeah.
And the other Schlesinger is the one who coined the term imperial presidency. And at that time, he was talking of a presidency which virtually can get whatever he wants.
Yes.
Now, the Kenyan president today may not be imperial, but it's very imperious. You know, those are things that we can go into. But what we need is to decongest the presidency, establish those two offices. That's number one.
That's one.
Number
Okay.
two is our voting system is first past the post. First past the post, which we have, leads to a number of things. One is polarization. Two is exclusion. It is winner take all. So, in a country of when you have a voting population where 15 million voted, and say 7 million point something voted for the winner, and the winner had a plurality of 200,000 votes only, they regard themselves as owning the whole thing. So that is first past the post. We need to bring another voting system, proportional representation. Now, we already have proportional representation, but it is at a very small margin. If you had proportional, and you can design your own proportional representation, the one that suits you. The good thing with the proportional representation is, one, it takes away with this winner takes all fixation that we have. Two, it leads to the creation of political parties, many political parties. And for it to work, these political parties are forced to coexist. And when various political parties are forced to coexist in coalitions or in whatever it is, people learn to look for the middle ground.
I'm sorry. I know you're going in a list here and we're at number 3. But when you talk about the fact that you want to remove this idea, or anybody could, start to, flirt with the idea of removing this whole competition thing, then one would imagine that you would need to remove the whole idea of an election, because an election is a competition. And that a competition suggests that there would be a winner. So if you're happy with an election, then surely you must then be happy with the outcome. If you know that we don't want to be in this situation whereby there will be this infatuation with one winner taking everything, then you need to change the system or the process where you make it a selective or representation selection, like some countries on this planet do. Why wouldn't we go that way?
Many democracies today, many liberal democracies today, have ditched the first past the post.
Yes.
They have a mixed. South Africa has predominantly proportional representation system. You still have winners. Germany, you still have winners in most of these democracies, except in America and France, and maybe Britain. But in many other places,
Switzerland,
you have proportional representation. And the merit of proportional representation is that in those systems, you hardly have dominant political parties that lord it over one election after the other. Two, it encourages cooperation between parties. And thirdly, barely do you find a party winning outrightly. Normally, you have to work together.
Okay.
If you have a system like that, that is by design. It means at the end of an election, you'll have perhaps one party which has got the largest members in parliament, but still not sufficient to run the government on its own. All right? You will then be forced to cut across, to look across, talk to people, and build coalitions. So I was saying we have to relook at our system of election and ask ourselves, do we want to maintain first past the post as it is, or is there need to think of proportional representation, which we already have, but now at a much, much more larger level?
But even as you talk about that, we saw during these the 2022 election when the president got to power and he did not have numbers, he reached across and they formed post-election coalitions, which is pretty much what you're talking about. But even then, as we talk about that, we have the aspect of politicians and their role in IEBC, because even as we speak right now, we know this election panel and the politics around it, that we have members who have been seconded from political parties. How does that go to create an IEBC that would perform? Because then one would argue that individuals who would be there are there with specific directives from those who seconded them to be in those positions.
Now you're bringing me back to the process. But we said deal with the macro environment. And I'll come to that. So, decongest the presidency, change the voting system, bring proportional representation, first past the post. Thirdly, deal with corruption. Not corruption in election, but corruption as a whole. When you bring money into politics, when money becomes entrenched in politics, you are on a slippery slope to a very dangerous place. So you have to find ways and means in which politics is cleaned, that you don't have a lot of money in politics. And to do that, you need to fight corruption, genuinely that is. You know, people have written papers and it has been found that the bigger corruption cases, you can predict when a big corruption case will occur.
Right.
It is either predicting, leading to an election or after an election.
The election.
Because this is capital mobilization for the purposes of running an election. And in Kenya, there have been several cases which you can, the occurrence of these major cases coincide with either an election or just before an election. And it has happened even in many countries. Like in America today, you can safely predict the winner of an election depending on how much money they can raise. So the amount of money a candidate in the US has raised predicts the likelihood that they will win or not win. You don't want that in Kenya today. And Kenyan people have done studies in Kenya about the cost of election in Kenya. Do you know that today, for you to become a governor, you really need to have perhaps $1 billion, from 600,000 to 1 billion shillings. That is your money for campaign. Now, when a governor spends, like for example, a candidate spends 1 billion shillings to be a governor, this money must be recouped somehow.
Somehow. It's an investment.
Yeah, it's an investment. So we are moving to a system, we are drifting to a system where money is taking the center stage in Kenyan politics. Today, those massive mammoth rallies that you see cost money. And I was surprised the other day when I was told there was a mammoth rally somewhere, and a politician told me that could not have cost less than 20 million shillings.
Just on a random day?
Yes.
Okay.
So we must bring that, deal with it, whichever way you want to deal with it. Then fourthly is to reform now IEBC, the one you've been talking about. And thirdly is to create a political environment where our political parties are regulated properly. As it is now, there is a framework for regulating political parties, but it is not enforced energetically, and it is also legalistic. So we now need to move to a regime where we work towards saying, how do you help political parties to be durable institutions? And durable institution means you are looking at the internal composition of these political parties, how they are built, and then how you regulate it, how you enforce those things. Those are 5 things which if you do, then you can now start talking of an election that is free, fair, and accountable. It is only after those that we can now talk about the process you were talking about. So let's come to the process. The one you were talking about, of the one you mentioned.
Yes.
You see, and we are still on election and rigging. The one you mentioned, the process.
Yes.
There are 6 ways or 7 to rig an election. And these have been studied. One, because you need to know them if you're talking about internal processes. 1 is gerrymandering. 2, ballot stuffing. 3, ballot patches. 4, state violence. 5, digital manipulation. 6 is the integrity of the electoral management body, the one we're talking about. 7th is manipulation of the reports of election supervisors and monitors. Now, you want an election where the process is perfect. You start with those. Once you started with those, then you use each one to analyze an election that you want to have. Let us start with, I mentioned there, the integrity of the electoral management body.
Yes.
If the electoral management body is not autonomous, you will have an election that is not free, fair, and accountable. So the challenge we have is, how do you make sure that you have an electoral management body that itself is autonomous, And we have tried in Kenya to do that. And even the process that we are doing now, is we are hoping to get that. Whether we are there or not, I doubt. But I can see efforts to get there, to have an electoral management body.
Do our laws give the IEBC autonomy?
The Constitution establishes the constitutional commissions and independent officers.
Yes.
And the Constitution says that these constitutional officers operate without control or advice or direction from anybody.
Yes.
So on paper then,
Yes.
and by the dicta of the Constitution, we have institutions like IEBC which are independent
institutions. Yes.
That is on the Constitution, and that is on the IEBC Act. All right?
However,
but IEBC needs money.
Yes, it does.
And IEBC doesn't have its own treasury. So IEBC must get money from somewhere. And if IEBC talks too much about its own independence, you can starve it of funds.
Absolutely.
Or releasing those funds so late in the day that IEBC cannot fulfill many of its functions. Number one. Number two, IEBC is independent. The Constitution says so, and the IEBC Act says so. But there is a vacancy in IEBC. For instance, I think this was in 2018 when Roslyn Akombe resigned, and thereafter the 3 others resigned. So from 2019 to around 2021, so there are 4 vacancies. IEBC is still independent. But here IEBC has 4 vacancies. IEBC cannot itself recruit commissioners for itself. Somebody has to do that. Now, City, it is still independent. IEBC does not stop being independent because, and the Supreme Court has said IEBC needs only 3 commissioners to run.
To operate, yes.
Yes, I don't agree with that because when the framers of the Constitution, the makers of the Constitution provided that you need 7 commissioners, 8 commissioners, there was a reason for it. Now, according to the Supreme Court, you only need 3 fellows to run the commission. And for a long time, the current IEBC, the one which has come to an end, there are only 3 commissioners. So how do you make sure that an organization then becomes dysfunctional? It is on paper and in the Constitution free, independent. But here 3 commissioners, 4 vacancies, they can't recruit themselves.
No, they can't. But also, is it that because all these things pivots and revolves around the finances that they need and them being made available in a timely fashion. Are there no legal ways to ensure that that money is ring-fenced so that they have the money? For instance, is Parliament independent? Yes. Does it have a Parliamentary Service Commission?
Yes.
It does. Recently, the police, I think, got one, but whether they've got the money or not is a different matter. Money is the issue. How is it, therefore, that an important function like that of the Electoral Commission cannot have a similar arrangement where the money will get to them? If they need more, is when you now need to go through the process of going to Parliament to justify what you need. But what is required is actually given to you. Why?
This is it, before we answer, you see there's another critical issue where you only hear of IEBC budgets when you are closer to the elections.
You see? Why? Because, to answer your question,
Yes.
and the question you asked initially was if they're independent, and we have agreed the Constitution and IEBC Act bestows on this independence.
Yes.
Now, you yourself have raised the issue of finances because that is a conduit by which IEBC can be rendered dysfunctional or dependent on somebody else.
Yes.
Now, you are saying, how do you ensure that that financial provision is fully taken care
Yes,
of?
that is made available as
It's
an
made available.
Yes.
Now, again, you can provide that IEBC submits a bill and is paid directly from the exchequer, directly from the consolidated fund.
Yes.
That can be done.
Yes.
But IEBC also must be oversighted somehow.
Yes.
Even if the most independent of all institutions, you still require somebody to oversight you.
Yes, you do.
So we have to ask as Kenyans, which is this institution do we want to oversee IEBC to make sure that IEBC runs the way it is supposed to do? Do you know why we don't have that? Because the idea of democracy is still alien to us as Kenyans. This is something that we talk about. This is something that is very easy on our lips. But the requirements of democracy, the dictates of democracy, even in Article 10, democracy is listed as one of our national values.
It does require an element of discipline, doesn't it?
But democracy ought to be democratic, ought to have it as a value, to have it ingrained in you so that it is part of your culture, it's part of your DNA. It's a different thing.
Absolutely. Look, these are the things that we need to put out there. Oftentimes we're asked, why do we have these conversations? Because if they remain unsaid, we are then not able to grasp the reality of their importance. And that's why we need to continue having them so that we can understand. I mean, there are things we've heard today that we've never put out into the open before. And that's why it's important that we do. And we open, we extend an invitation to you to come back, for us to continue to open up some of these matters. And we thank you for doing that this morning. And we look forward to the next time that you can. Major James Oswago, former IEBC CEO, has been our guest this hour, looking at IEBC and constitutionality and putting some of these things into perspective.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.